Welcome to week 3. This week we'll be getting into GrowFX and shaders inside of V-Ray for kind of hard surface objects. I'd like to start off with GrowFX, and then the next video will cover shaders. So moving right along, if we can just make sure that everybody's on the same page as far as units, that's going to be pretty important in this portion. So let's make sure everybody is at least displaying feet. Obviously, if your systems are in inches, that's great too. But display feet, inches, so that your units and whatnot will remain the same. And as you follow along, you'll get the same result. After, if you'd like to have a different display unit, by all means, go ahead. So when you first start out, you want to create a GrowFX object. You will come to your Create tab, you will go under X Level, and you will click the GrowFX button. You will then click and drag out this nice little icon, and generally what I do is I start by changing my icon size. For trees and whatnot, I'll place it to around 6 feet, and then for other plants, depending on what size the plant is, I might place that icon to 1 foot or 6 inches, and really only just to give myself a point of reference. When I'm doing a tree, I like to see something that is kind of the human scale in reference to what I'm working on. So this is a nice little way to see that. So then second, generally I name my plants like GrowFX, tree, or I'll generally call it by the species. It might be an oak or a Doug fir or whatever. This guy I'm going to name GrowFX tree A, and you'll see one of the nice things about GrowFX is your ability to, once you've created one, create an army of them all seeded off that original plant or tree that you've created. So once you've named your object and set up an icon size, you will come down here to paths, and before you can do anything, you need to create a path. Again, organizational wise, I name these generally. You start with a trunk, and then you've got these path parameters. Each of these gives a flyout. I will get into after mesh modifiers in a later tutorial, but let's start with these distributors, direction modifiers, and mesh modifiers. So this kind of is the sequence of how you create a plant within GrowFX. You'll create a distributor. You will then modify it with directions and different vectors and whatnot. These are like your effectors. And then you will mesh it. And there's a couple different meshing objects for any plant. So right out the gate, we will click on the Create Distributor list. And there's a couple of different types of distributors. There is a distributor which this shoots off a spline basically from the center of your icon. There are also point distributors. These will shoot off splines from a point helper. X Level also has, under the helpers tab, its own little like vectors and point helpers, which are really important, and I'll show you guys those. I'll do an IV setup and show you how I use those for things like that. Path distributors, these are basically how you create branches and children of a given distributor or a point distributor. Path position, these you are allowed to tell it specifically where you want it to be. This kind of, you can tell it a range. You want it to be from 0% to 100%, and it'll distribute all along the parent spline. This one, you can tell it I want to distribute one child spline along or at 100%. That would be this drawing, like at the very top, that's 100% along the path, or you could say at 0% along the path. Surface distributors, these, just as you would guess, this creates these splines off of a given surface. Generally for a tree and for a lot of different things, I'll just create, to start as my initial parent, a regular distributor. So there's a lot of different options over here, and I will get into those, but I kind of want to show you the general workflow, and then we can talk specifics. as we create some different plants. So I'm going to give a general overview right now, and then I will go into in a couple other videos, like here's creating this kind of hero tree, another hero tree, some hero plants. But this will give you guys a foundation that you can then follow along or have an understanding that we're all on the same page. So to start, let's say just give this guy, make him 20 feet. So this is my main kind of trunk, and this chaos, this will introduce chaos in the length when you have, if you're using like a path distributor and there's lots of branches. By setting this chaos value to something, you know, above 10 or 20, it introduces length variation, which also becomes really important when you go to seed over here and you want to make lots of variations of the same plant. So I'm not going to do that right now because I only have one, but when I create some children of this, I will do that. Step size, this is really important. It's going to control basically the tessellation of your mesh and of this spline and how the modifiers affect objects. Wind, things like that, they need a decent amount of step size in order for them to react correctly to the object. So you want to kind of watch that step size, but you also want to be sensitive to it, because if your step size is always at 1 inch and you're making a 100-foot tree, you are basically over tessellating it and over complicating something that could be brought down pretty substantially. So it's something you want a lot of when you need it, but you also want to kind of monitor it and control it. For something like this, generally I'll start with 3 inches or 2 inches, but there are some modifiers that will allow us to kind of optimize it after the fact. But let's say I'm going to move forward and I'm going to do 3 inches. You can also over here, you can show points on path. So this will give you an idea of, you know, what that 3 inches is. It's not just some, you know, intangible thing. So you can see like that's a fair amount of you know, of tessellation along that object. So let's just say 3 inches, and I'm going to turn that back off because if you have that on, it can actually, if you have a very complicated tree, it will increase your redraw time. So then you've got the modifier list. I'm going to hit kind of the biggies at first, and as I create other trees in other lessons, we'll go over some of them, and I will probably introduce a couple over the course of this tutorial. So when I don't tell you what every single one of these does, don't worry about it, I will. The main ones that I use though are the random direction, this vector direction, noise direction, wind animation, object reaction, and sometimes the erase. Those are like the big ones, but I for the most part use every single one of them in some different way. Random direction, as you could guess, that gives some random direction to your initial spline. So right now you'll see it's like just a curly little mess of nothing. So by tweaking this smoothing value, I can make that more or less refined, right? The other thing I can do, and you can do this for all of these modifiers, is I can throw a curve on this, and this will allow me to say I want a value at 0%, let's say of 2 or 3, and then at 100% I want it to be a lot more crazy, and you'll see this once I throw like a Bezier on this. And so now I've got something that is relatively straight as it starts off and grows, but then as it gets up higher becomes a little bit crazier. And that's nice just for introducing, you know, that chaos, but when you want a trunk that isn't like, you know, all wavy and crazy and whatnot. So this is a good way to do that, give you both worlds. So don't forget about these, the spline or the curves. This is very important. You won't be able to forget about them by the time you're done with this, but keep it in the back of your mind, okay? So that's a random noise. I like this because it's, you know, gives kind of much more like three-dimensional effect than what just a noise direction will do. this, kind of as this drawing shows, it's a little bit more irregular. I generally use this on branches, and I'll use it on the trunk, but in a, more kind of, just to kind of like vary it kind of jaggedly and quickly. And you won't think that this will do much, but once you mesh this guy, you're going to see these subtle variations on the trunk, which are nice. Like, that stuff is really important. Generally, I put these noise modifiers on here, just pretty subtle on my trunk. The other thing, once you start to get multiples of these, the order matters. So let's add an object modifier. This is the best way, or an object reaction. This is the best way to illustrate this. So I'm going to go back out and I'm going to create a plane, right? And let's just, well, actually, let's create a box so it's actually got some volume to it. It prefers that. Okay, so I'm going to have this GrowFX object interact with that box now. And if I say object reaction and I pick this object, so you'll see immediately it reflects it. It's reflecting it because this reflection amount is turned on and it's set to 5 inches by default. I'm going to get into some very detailed things about this modifier specifically, so I'm going to kind of gloss over this real quick just to illustrate the point of order of operations here. Now, if I first started with my object reaction and then I introduced a random noise, and let's turn this guy off. Well, let's move this guy further down. Oh, did they change something with the new build? Oh, this might be the new hotness. Normally, no kidding. Let's turn magnetic on. Let's grab this guy. Okay, so, nope, this is new. All right. Oh, here we go. Now it's doing it. Okay, so you've got this guy is kind of penetrating it now at this point, because my object reaction is the first operation to happen. Sorry, they just came out with a new build, and I wasn't sure if they had changed something with this. This is actually my first time working with this build. So you can reorder these at any point just by pulling them in that direction. Now we can randomize this direction all we want, and it will continue to react to that box in a way that is fitting for what we want to do. But that's something to consider. If you put noise here and then, or like a wind and then have object reaction, you'll get this kind of noisy thing, and then it's also trying to cling to the object. That would obviously be pretty bad. So that's one where it's pretty clear the order matters. So I'm going to turn this guy back on, and let's say I was happy with this. This is my trunk. So the next thing is you will create child paths. So I'm going to call this B1. Okay, so this would be, I'm going to say these are like my main branches. And again, similar workflow. You go back to a distributor, create a distributor, and this time I'm going to create a path distributor. And I will say OK. And first, you don't see anything. You have to add a path that you want it to be a child of. So here we only have one option, so we'll say trunk, and you'll see now I have, all of these guys sticking out all over the place. So now we dive into this distributor parameters tab. You've got your density. This is controlling the density of the child distributors. You have your range, start and end. I generally, I don't have my branches start at 0, except for some very specific instances. Your end being, 100% presumably. You also have your count. This is how many off of each point that it distributes. So this would be if you were making a fern, and they've got like a very specific pattern to how the leaves are. This would be how you would start by going about doing that. It's setting your count to 2. For a tree, the branches don't work that way. So generally I keep my count to 1 and then crank my density as required. Angle divergence, this is going to control angle around that child spline. Bend, this is the bend or the parent spline. This is controls kind of how upright or their bend relative to the parent. Then chaos angle, obviously you want to introduce some of that as well. Offset, these will set them, you can see them kind of going off of that parent spline, and then you can give a chaos to that. This one's pretty important for other things, but something like branches, you don't really want to do that. I'll get into some of this other stuff too that I kind of am glossing over, but this would be the initial, like, I'm making a branch. Now the next thing, trees don't really grow like this, right? Branches, as they get up higher on the tree, they get shorter. So you want to introduce these effectors. Let's see if I do this right, because I always do this wrong. These guys are a little bit confusing. So if you feel at all confused, don't worry about it. It's not very clear. So I want to affect the length, my path position, the position along the path. I want to affect the length of my my spline, basically. So that's what we're doing here, and then I will click on this graph, and you will see now where they're at 0, they're 1, meaning they're 8'4". Well, they're not 8'4". They're actually what is it? Well, I think actually, yeah, this guy acts like a multiplier. Sorry, and I generally use it as such. So I'll set this, to 1, and throw like a Bezier on this. And generally not that much. I don't really ever let them get to 0 because that's kind of not what you really want. But it is nice to have this, a little bit more. And then I will add, this is a case where now I start to add some chaos, because all of the branches, I don't want them to be the same length. The other thing, so once I've done something like that, the other thing I do is with density, I'll throw a curve on this as well, and I want this to be more dense along, like trees as they get further up the up to the top, that new growth as it comes in, it's more dense, and toward the bottom it's going to be less dense. Now this is the position along the path, and as you remember, 39 is my start position. So if I introduce a point here and I come down here and I say 39, this is actually the starting point of my first branch. So if I want to control its density, I need to start from that point and bring these guys down. And then likewise, if I want this to be, much more dense, I'm going to need to throw a curve to get this guy to really kind of come out. And I'll do something like that. But it's important, pay attention to these values, because you can tweak this all day long. You can think you're doing all sorts of stuff, but you're actually not, because this is the position along its parent's path. Let's bring this guy down a little bit more. So just to give it a little bit of variation. And generally I make this a little bit more stark of a contrast, depending on what I'm doing. So something, a little bit more like that. The other thing I will do with these guys is, these look pretty crappy. So I will also throw a random noise on my branches, and generally I raise this smoothing amount a little bit just to give them some like subtle motion. And then I will put no, not yet. I'll put a noise on these guys as well, and just to give them some more kind of body to them, and maybe make that a little bigger. And then the next thing I do is, as I said, this vector direction. This guy's really important as well. So out the gate, he's throwing a downward vector because he's at -10 relative to your GrowFX, its parent icon, or like this guy where these guys are shooting off, or where its parent is shooting off from. So it's just kind of -10. It's like a gravity added to it. That's cool and all, but I don't generally like them to droop so much like this. It's more realistic. Kind of a tree will shoot out a little bit, then it droops, and they kind of start to come back up, and that's great. We can do that. Let's go back to our branch by throwing a curve on this. And right now, like out the gate, I'm like at a 10, and that's fine. I might put this one now at 100%. Let's say I'll go -20, just something more as a contrast. And just by doing something as simple as this, they're already starting to have a little bit more shape and interest. Again, throw a curve on this, and I'm just right-clicking on these guys to bring up that menu. This all acts just like your material editor, like an output would act. So this is great because it's I'm coming up and then kind of doing this like curve, but it's not quite what I want. Really, what I want is something a little bit more, like this. I want these guys to start to like kind of pick back up. And just give a little bit more interest to those branches. And you can see you might get like what appears to be a pretty funky curve, but it allows you a ton of control over what this stuff's going to look like. And again, maybe pull that guy out. Let's bring this guy up a little bit. Bring this guy back up. So maybe something like that. I don't know. It would depend what type of tree I'm making. But my curves, it's not always just like a little Bezier here and a Bezier here. I'll get pretty specific and really drawing out what I want these branches to do. So that would be, let's say this is my first level of branching, and I want these guys longer. It's kind of a crazy looking tree. So then I would create another branch layer, and you can label these guys like kind of however you want. One thing to note, ordering of modifiers does matter over here. You can also click and drag these guys and move them around. Ordering here does not matter. Okay, so on your modifier it does matter. Over here it does not matter. It's more like organizational, and you'll see like once you get into like root systems and some of the more interesting cool stuff, you'll have like you might want to drag up the roots below the trunk after you like make everything else. It's kind of for your own organizational purposes. So now I'm going to, again, path distributor, create another one. I have to tell it the starting path or its child or parent path. And once again, these guys are crazy. So we'll change the length along the path. So I went path position. So this is along the position its given position on the path, I want to affect the length, and then I'm going to, again, throw a curve on that. I'm just going to make these a couple little Beziers here, and something like this. I don't want them to get so short. So let's say, you know, whatever, something like that. Again, random direction, and adjust that smoothing to kind of control, you know, how much it's affecting it. And the other thing you can do is this levels. Like I could say I want this to branch twice. You'll see, like, instead of just making one child, this is making two children. This is a good way to kind of get kind of these subsidiary branches that also then have the exact same direction modifiers applied to them. The other thing you can do, and this is pretty awesome, you can come here and you can copy and instance these guys. I don't normally do that with like random and noise and vectors and things like that. Every once in a while I'll copy a vector, but I do it a ton with the object reaction. Let's say I've got like 15 paths on a given plant or tree or something like that, and they're all reacting to a wall. I want them growing on that wall, and I want the whole tree following like the same rules. I will make one object reaction, and you can copy, and then you can paste this as an instance, and you can paste it as an instance on every single layer. That way when you change the one, hence instancing, it will change the others. So I implore you, mess with these modifiers, copying and pasting them. If you get like something set that you're really liking on one, you can always copy it and paste it to the other. I'm not really paying attention a whole ton to my step size on these branches. Generally I'll leave them around 1 or 2 or something like that. But let's say, all right, well, branch 1, I left this guy at 1, and I really shouldn't have. If you were to say, I want this guy actually at 2, and you did that, well, unfortunately I don't have anything going on too crazy right now that it didn't dramatically change. But what can happen if you change this step size to like 4, you're going to start to see some pretty dramatic changes and things, and you might have like crafted this thing exactly the way you wanted to before. 1 was exactly what you wanted, this thing was exactly what you wanted, and instead of having to come up here and compromise now on your step size after the fact, you can come down and say optimize steps, and this will give you the same look, but now you have an angle tolerance, and you can kind of come in here and say show paths on, or show points on path, and now you can tweak this by raising this, and it tries its best to maintain the angles that you've kind of established, but minimize. It's kind of like a pro optimize, for your mesh, but maintaining, the look. So that's an important one to get to know as well. So if we come back to our B2, so that would be my branches. Generally, I will have like 3 to 4 branches, like branches and twigs and whatnot, before I even get to doing my leaves. So I might set, this guy. Might set these guys a little bit longer still yet. And you can see the longer I make this, that curve, because it's a curve based on the position along the path, because I made those branches longer, I'm getting some funky results. So as I make this guy shorter, it's doing kind of different things. So you would want to come back in and mess with that curve. Now, I might create, turn that guy back on. So at any point, you see these guys all have lights. I can turn them on and turn them off and whatnot. I might make this layer my twigs. So I generally have like twigs, and that's what I'm going to like birth the leaves off of. And again, I would make a path distributor, and I would come up here to add point, make this guy B2, set this guy to maybe like 2 feet, and give it some chaos of like 40. And these I generally don't put a ton of before I was really like clamping the length down along the body of the branch, and the twigs I don't so often do that, simply because I want there to be some length and some body toward the end. But the one thing I will do still is add random direction. Sometimes I give these a little bit more than what I give some of the other stuff. I also, what you'll see, the way I set this like density up here, so I'm getting more here, I would also do the same thing on this. You normally, like your tree, you don't have like tons of branches coming off like right at the base of a branch. Like the branch starts to grow, things toward the bottom will fall off, and you have new growth out toward the outside of that branch, and that will help to give your tree a more natural body. So again, I would come in here and say density, bring that guy way down, bring this guy way up. And because they do start at 0, I can bring that 0 pretty substantially down, and then throw a curve on this. Something like that. Maybe that's too much, but same thing here. So I can choke this out a little bit and get them kind of moving off the base, and it's a little nicer to do it that way than setting it specifically here, because this I can now add like a chaos to just a little bit, and when I reseed new variations, it won't be so explicitly set as this here. If I said like I only want these guys to start at 10, they will only ever start at 10 or 20 or what have you. In this way, I can set an overall density along the path, but then I can also introduce some chaos to it, and still at 0% you might get something birthing. So I'll generally do something like this as well on the branches, and then the twigs, I'll kind of let those, again, depending on the plant, I'll let those birth all along my branch. So once I've set up my twigs, let's say I added some modifiers to it, and I wanted to create some leaves. So I create, yet again, another path, come up here to distributors. Leaves are also path position, and I give them a child. You can, so I'm just going to show you here, you can set multiples here. No, not 6 feet, 6 inches. So right now you'll see it's only growing on twigs. Let's say you set up like 2 different twig systems, and I do that. You can say you want it on twigs and on B1. So now these leaves are going to be growing on your branches. Well, these are B2 rather, not B1. Your secondary branches and on those twigs. So keep that in mind as well. Now, depending on the type of tree, you might want to set your count to 2, because you might want this type of leaf structure. Totally depends on the plant, or on the tree or plant. And again, I'm going to introduce some chaos into these lengths. And here, generally, because it's going to be the leaves, I'm going to get much more density. So, and you'll see like viewport performance will slow down. Right now, this isn't going to be really that bad at all. So that would be kind of setting up. And the other thing you might want to do with this is set this guy to vector direction for your leaves, and then orientation for leaves. That's going to kind of keep them facing, what is it, like rotated up. Yeah, there we go. So they're like trying to get up to the sun. All right, so this is a, pretty not beautiful tree. But let's say this is exactly what you were looking for, and now we want to mesh it. So there's a couple of different types of meshes. We have the cylinder, meta, leaf meshes, instance geo, and standard leaves. Standard leaves, these are very basic shapes. Instance geo is exactly what you would think. You can, I do this for like flower petal, like flowering plants. I'll create a flower and then bake that to a mesh and then instance it back onto the tree that I'm going to use, or this, into a system. Meta mesh, this guy's sweet because you can see like what this drawing is showing you. It's based on this like branch child, or the parent-child relationship here. This will sew together the mesh, basically like frost meshing it into one unified skin. It's really great, but it's also like use with caution, okay? Don't build your whole tree out of meta mesh. Like, that's just insane. Generally, I reserve that for my trunk and my main branching kind of architecture, and then maybe my root systems as well that like go off the tree. And that's about it. And again, that's even for just like a hero tree. If it's a mid to background tree, I don't bother with meta meshing. Most of the time, you're going to use this kind of cylinder mesh, and this is what we're all familiar with from Onyx. Now, I put the mesh on there. I've got a mesh, but you don't see anything right now. Oh, thank you. I'm set up different than my work computer. So the other display parameters that we haven't really gone over here yet are, you've got lines and mesh, you've got your wire color and whatnot. So if you want to display as mesh, you need to click on mesh. Now, what might happen for you is you click on mesh and it disappears. No big deal. You still have it selected. Just click off of it and it will reappear for you, and then you can click back on. It's just a display bug. They might have worked that out by now, but it does happen. So we have a radius for our mesh, and like most things, as I've said, I throw a curve on it. I want my trunk to be, much thicker than, than the top of the tree. So we'll, kind of make that much more grand. And generally, I throw a curve on this as well. I might throw a couple of curves on something like this, depending on what type of tree and what type of structure I'm looking for. So you can take this off of 0, or you can define your minimum radius here, and you could say, like, I only ever want this thing to get as small as not 1 foot, but 1 inch. And in that way, it never goes down to, like, nothing. So either way, it's totally up to you. This is the minimum number of sides, because we have a fairly high step size on our trunk. This is not having a huge factor at the moment, and we also have a wide enough radius. If we started to get smaller radiuses, it's going to try to collapse down on itself, and this is really something that you have to watch out for on branches, that you're not just getting 3 sides on your branch, that you have a minimum of 5 or 7. The other thing, your face size of 1 inch, you can tweak this guy, set him, and it's going to try to optimize it. You can choose to or not. That's similar to the optimizing steps. So this, you'll see this relationship is staying the same, right? But as I change this face size, it's going to collapse down on itself as much as it can to this minimum size. So you'll oops. So this is where this becomes important. Now, the reason why it becomes important on branches is because your branch might have a thinner radius than 3 inches. And in which case, like you're seeing here, if I set this guy to 1 foot and this to 3, my face size is now bigger than the diameter of my trunk, so it's trying to like optimize it as much as possible. So that's also something, you know, to kind of watch out for. But you do want to definitely take into consideration this face size and try to optimize it as much as possible. GrowFX is not invincible, and neither is your computer. So if you go along not paying attention to these face sizes and what it's doing in the mesh, you will crash quickly. So this might be my trunk, and maybe I want this guy a little thicker. I don't know. Sure. And you'll see now, like, that noise that I was talking about, it'll like, you know, have a nice impact on the mesh. And again, you know, sometimes while I'm making these, I go back, and now that I've got it meshed, you can still come in here and you can tweak these values, and you can say, you know, I want this to be much stronger. And the nice thing about this is all, you know, non-destructive. You can mesh it and then come back and keep tweaking stuff. And I often do, like, you know, what might look good in silhouette and spline form, once you start to mesh it, you're like, wow, that looks like shit. So, you know, bear in mind that you might want to change once you start meshing. So don't get too in love with your spline tree, honestly, is the best advice I can give you. Get it going and then start meshing pretty quickly, and then keep tweaking from there. So I'm gonna bring this guy up to 1, but there's a box here that's checked. This radius is less than the parent radius, so this is going to try to help you to manage that its starting radius will never be greater than the radius at the point along the position where this guy is birthed. So that's an important checkbox, and generally I don't let it get that close to it, but you know, you want them to have some sort of something to them. Again, so zoom extents, and maybe throw a curve on this, so these guys have some more interest to them. And so this is a time where I often, at this point, I will copy my cylinder mesh, and depending on how many branches I have, I might paste an instance or paste the mesh builder up on top of itself. Because of that checkbox, this parent radius here, this works out really well for branches. Again, you know, here you might want to tweak it. It's totally up to you. Depends on the type of tree. For my taste, that's, you know, too much, and I would. And once we get into some other trees, I will. Again, though, you can paste this guy back onto here for the twigs. And now we've got twigs. And now for the leaves, as I pointed out before, there's these leaf meshes, and then there's standard leaves. I almost always use leaf meshes. Or you could instance geo. You could handcraft your leaf a very specific way and instance it on. That is valid in some cases. Very, very hero object. You don't want to use an opacity map, and you want to be able to use like subsurface or refraction or something like that. That might be an instance where you want to use, you know, an actual leaf geo, two-sided, a little bit of thickness, all of that stuff. For 99% of the trees, I use this leaf mesh. And this guy's pretty cool because he's like a procedural mesh. Just for sake of speed, I'm going to bring this down. At this point, my density is basically like a 10 because I also have a count of 2 on that. And that's fairly dense. Again, it depends, you know, the scale of your tree, all that stuff. So this leaf mesh, you'll see I've got this like fold here in the middle. This is where, you know, this is really great for leaves and catching like nice reflections. You can spec, or, you know, kind of tell this guy to fold as a real leaf, you know, does. Which is nice. It really helps to sell it. You can see it here, like these guys are kind of folding. Again, you know, your step size and your face size, these guys are going to run hand in hand. You don't want to have, crazy high amounts of polys on your leaves, but you do want to try to get them the best you can to, come down a little bit. Here they're not doing anything now. So the other thing that's going to determine the amount of tessellation you're going to have on this leaf, you can see it's got this like leaf shape to it. That's controlled by the width. If I turn this off, now you'll see my leaves are 1 inch wide. Okay, they're 6 inches long because that's the length of the path, and they're 1 inch wide because it says so. And in which case now you can come in here and you can more explicitly control the tessellation of these guys. My guy wants to be 10. So generally though, I use this width graph, and depending on the type of leaf, I might make it a little bit fatter out here. If it was like an oak or something like that, you want to be able to put that map on it in an appropriate manner. So I'll tweak these like leaf meshes out a little bit, and that's very quickly the leaf mesh. I will get into that in more detail. I will be using that a lot. So once you've got a mesh, the next thing to do is UV your object. Now by default this guy has UVs on it, and I'm going to open up my material editor, and I'm going to, just with a default shader, grab a checker and throw it on here, and let's display the checker. Alright, so you can see it's got UVs. Now they're not the best UVs, granted, and generally if you're going to put like a tiling map on this, you don't want it to be stretching that far. So what you can do is down here under UV mapping, you can set absolute values for this, and oftentimes I find something around like 8 foot, 6 foot to 8 foot generally works for a lot of the textures out there. You can mess with this value though, and and dial that in, but I always set this or mess with this on some level. And again, you can, if we had instanced that mesh, if I changed this one, the other one would change as well and update. So you go through and update each of these, the UVs on these plants, and likewise. So one thing I didn't, yes, I did. Okay, so I did introduce some chaos into the leaves, and this is good because you don't want all your leaves to be the same size. This is one reason why I use these the leaf mesh as opposed to the simple leaf or the instance. In the instance, you can give some scale variation and stuff like that, but it won't allow you. You don't have some of like the procedural controls that that you have if you're using this type of shader method. For the leaves, though, I generally, depending on what I'm doing and if I want a lot of variation and chaos in my leaf size, I will leave the UV map to kind of stretched on this surface and then tile based off of that, so that my UVs, the leaves are always covering the entire surface, but it allows me to have some variation. If I set them explicitly and then my leaf texture is always this size, it doesn't matter if this mesh got bigger or smaller, the leaves will always be the same size because that leaf is being determined by a UV space that is explicitly set, as opposed to letting GrowFX manage that. So that's one thing to consider when you're UVing the leaves and the meshes themselves. The other thing, and this is the last thing I'm going to cover in this intro, and then we'll get into some more specifics and actually building some nice plants, not this crappy thing. So the other thing is, generally when I'm building shaders for these trees, I build multi-subs, and then by default, GrowFX, if you come into here, and these mesh guys, they've got mat IDs set to 1 on the body, on anything that is like a cylinder or meta mesh, and then on leaves, it automatically sets it to 2. Now you can also say, I want to add more, and you can give it 2, 3, and 4. I generally do something like this, in which case you can say like 2, maybe I want that to be 60% of the leaves are going to have this shader, 20% or 30% are going to have this shader, and 10% are going to be mat ID 4. I often do something like this where this is my overall green, if it's a green tree. This is a little bit more yellow, and then these are like my brown, more brown, the few dying ones. The other thing that we are going to get into, which is just freaking awesome, is the vertex color, and using vertex color in your shaders, and how to go about using this to give variation along the paths, to make the tips of your leaves have a little bit of slight yellow to them, and so on and so forth. Make the branches, like as it comes down, you can change the vertex color and map by vertex color to give your trunk some subtle variation down there as well, or it's a little bit darker, stuff like that. This is incredibly powerful, and we'll get into that. With that though, this concludes the intro to GrowFX video. This is just meant to be a base, so glean from this what you can, and we'll be moving into some more, or quite a bit more advanced stuff from here. All right.